Well, believe it or not, I have tried to record this video 4 times, and this is my fifth attempt, and made sure I got coffee beforehand. So here's to you, I guess. Here we go. I am going to jump ahead about 200 years between when we leave Greece and when we join Rome. And during those 200 years, of course, there were sophists who were going around still practicing law and teaching people how to speak, charging a lot of money. But really, we jump into Rome because we lose track of anything really too significant at this point for us. There is some work from Longinus and from others in your book that you can read if you'd like to. But really, we're looking at a jump of about 200 years to Rome. And Rome, of course, is fascinating because we are mainly interested in the relationship between rhetoric and, in this case, power. Why is that the case? We are going to look at Rome during the period of about 100 BCE to about 1 to 200 CE. And during those 300 years or so, we're going to only talk about two individuals. We're going to talk about Cicero. We're going to talk about Quintilian. But really, what we're really discussing is the relationship between rhetoric and power as it is exemplified by the context and the historical backdrop of the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. So let's start with Cicero. The relationship between power and rhetoric can generally be summed up in one small sort of idiom, and that is that the greater the need for rhetoric is built when there is a more decentralized government. So the more decentralized a power, the greater the need for rhetoric. The opposite is also true. The more centralized a power, the less the need for rhetoric. And you might be thinking right now, but wait a minute, what about Hitler? He was supposedly a great rhetorician. A lot of people talk about what a charismatic speaker he was, and he was a dictator. And yes, that's true. And he did, in fact, use the power of rhetoric in order to gain power and eventually get up to the top. But once he was there, it was coercion and threat that managed to get people murdered. It was not his great rhetorical skill, because the way this works is that the more participation you need to have from your polity, from your people, from your citizenry, the greater need they have to understand how the government's working and how they can use rhetoric in order to make them more powerful, or in order to move through the classes and so on and so forth. And so we're going to actually use Rome as a demonstration of how that theory or idea of the relationship between power and rhetoric works. Cicero, during the time of the Roman Republic, was pretty high up in government. In fact, some say that he was so high up that there was a soap opera version of his life that has been sort of speculated about, but is probably not true. But some speculate that he was one of four very powerful government citizens and senators who were going to talk about what to do with the Republic, because it was starting to have some major issues. And probably more likely, Cicero thought the answers could be found in the citizenry. And the other three thought, no, that's not possible. The other three wanted power. In fact, you know how the story ends eventually. So really, some people, soap opera versions say, Mark Antony, not the singer, the Roman, went down to visit Cleopatra, and she would tell him, look, Cicero's a big threat. He's too powerful. He's going to take power away from you. We don't want that to happen. And told him to basically bring Cicero's head on a plate to her. Of course, we don't have any proof of that happening. What we do know is that Cicero was not asked to commit suicide. He was not given a trial. He was not accused of corrupting the youth. He was accused of attempting to undermine the government, and his hands and his tongue were in fact cut out, and probably his head was put on a spike. Did I say spike? On a pike. But his hands and his tongue, it's rumored that they were actually nailed either to, depending on which historian you read, the gates of the city or the over the what would be the city hall or what would have been the Senate House. And so, just going to show how powerful of a speaker Cicero was. Cicero's book, De Orate, is about oration and how to be a good speaker. Most people consider it the first public speaking textbook ever written. Of course, Cicero is credited with taking Aristotle's ideas and organizing them into the 5 canons of rhetoric. Cicero talks about the fact that the education of a human should start at the point of birth, really, because rhetoric needs to be practiced well around a baby in order for that baby to grow up to be a well-spoken child. In fact, I think at one point he says the wet nurses should be trained in rhetoric so that the child will also be trained in rhetoric. By the way, if you're reading those new ideas that have come up in the past 20 years about how you shouldn't talk baby talk to your baby, this is exactly where part of that should actually come from, is the idea that if you speak well to your baby will develop faster. Now, that may or may not be true. I've got a nephew who's rolling over at 3.5 months. I didn't believe it until I saw it. But he's doing that. Maybe it's because his aunts and uncles and his mom and dad are all extremely well educated. I don't know. Maybe I'm going to brag a little bit about that. But Cicero felt that if you were going to truly be a good rhetorician, you not only had to practice these 5 skills and 5 canons, and you not only had to be very, very good at invention, which of course, again, the most important, but you also had to be raised in it, because just having the talent was not enough. And Cicero certainly did believe that there was a talent that was had, but that you could also be taught, just as long as you were taught well. And so Cicero really, first public speaking textbook, focuses heavily actually on style as well. And a lot of us just say, well, style is the way that you do delivery, the style of your delivery, ... But that is actually incorrect. He takes style and explains that style is not about the speaker. Style is actually about the audience. You have to look at who your audience is and what level your audience is at in order to understand what style you should use. So you have the 3, the grand, the middle, and the common styles, but they are not, your everyday street talk, and then maybe your teaching talk when you're in the classroom, and then some grandiose style that President Obama uses. That's not accurate. So make sure that you focus heavily reading about style and how important Cicero's work is on that, because it often goes ignored. Cicero also gives us the type of narratives that should and should not be used in a rhetorical act. And I think that those are very important for us. And I think all of this is incredibly important right now, because if you listened to what I said, that Cicero was listened to, and he was considered to be too dangerous because the Republic wanted him elected, or he felt that he should give power back to the people, and that's what got him killed. And you're thinking, wow, that sounds familiar to 2016. Then you and I are probably sharing way too much time together. After Cicero was murdered, a lot of people argue that that was the fall of the Roman Republic. Of course, we don't actually put it there, but a lot of historians would argue that the death of Cicero marked, if not the beginning of the fall of the Republic, then the actual fall of the Republic, because hope for a democratic system of government had at that point gone away. And of course, we got into an oligarchy, or basically the triumvirate rule for some time, and enter the rule of the emperors. And we have Quintilian step into the picture about 100 CE or so. And Quintilian saw what happened to Cicero. Quintilian felt that Cicero was the greatest, most perfect orator of all time. And so he wanted to be like Cicero. Some people argue that if Cicero wrote the public speaking textbook, then Quintilian wrote the teacher's edition. How does that work? Well, look at the context and what we said about power. During Quintilian's time, the Roman Empire, the need for rhetoric was very, very low by comparison to the great need during the time of the Roman Republic. And so he also knew what happened to Cicero. Cicero would have been too dangerous. So Quintilian decided it's important to teach rhetoric. I can't do it, not the way I'm supposed to. How can I do it? And ultimately, Quintilian realized that he could teach to the children of the very powerful leaders in government. And he could teach teachers how to do this in hope for the future later. And so that's essentially what he did. And in doing that, he defined rhetoric, or at least an orator, a little bit differently. He really put in the idea of ethics. A good person speaking well. You have to have the talent. You have to be raised in it, but you also have to just be a good person. This is going to heavily piss off somebody in the late Middle Ages to the early Renaissance, by the way. But the idea that if you are going to speak, you better speak the truth and you better speak it well, but you better be a good person before you even try to do anything else. This harkens back to Aristotle's idea of goodwill. It harkens back to the idea that when you are practicing rhetoric, if you are not practicing the truth, preaching the truth, you are not practicing rhetoric. And so he wrote sort of in a way that preserved the ideas of rhetoric, the original ideas of rhetoric, while at the same time adapting to the power of the Roman Empire. And as we move away from Cicero and Quintilian, conceivably two of the most influential in rhetoric, despite being the only two that we study from the Roman period or even pay attention to, we're going to actually see that the reins are going to tighten on the use of rhetoric as we move into the Middle Ages. And the next video will address the Middle Ages and St. Augustine.